I'll try to provide more information about how we can make the most of the financial and human resources for inclusive education. So I'll begin with explaining briefly what is inclusive education in principle that Malensko did so well. So I'll just add a little bit to this discussion that he started. And then I will discuss briefly how the decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that countries are asked to make as far as their policy is concerned. And then I will talk about financial resources, human resources, and I'll finish with the conclusion. So I chose to start by making this statement that inclusive education is about all children, because it seems that it's still not clear to teachers and to different countries' policymakers because of the history of how the concept developed. Indeed, inclusive education is about access, presence, as Mel said before, participation, but not in statistical terms, in meaningful participation, collaboration, and progress for all children. Another important principle is that all children have intersectional identities when we discuss about inclusive education. So we should not think of children's one identity and try to provide support around this identity, but rather realize that they have intersectional identities and the education system needs to consider them all. Of course, children at risk of exclusion will be benefited from inclusive education systems, and that's why we're trying to develop the systems and make them more inclusive, because everybody will be benefited, including children at risk of exclusion. So decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that need to be made. It's the whole policy framework that countries develop and follow. And sometimes, as we already heard, we have inclusive education policies that might not serve inclusion, because these are followed by other scattered policies about different aspects of the education system that don't follow the inclusive education principle. It's also linked with the decisions that countries make about the national curricula. And there's this discussion among countries and among teachers whether it is more appropriate to have common curriculum for all or a special curriculum for different groups of children. Even if we have a common curriculum, that doesn't mean that it's an inclusive one. So inclusive curricula need to be adaptable, flexible, and correspond to all learners' profiles. Standardization is also a barrier to inclusive education. The fact that support is based on diagnosis in many countries is also a barrier, and it's something that most countries learn to work with this principle and put all their sources in special education or in following a child. Parallel systems of special and mainstream education have been there in many countries, embedded in teachers' understanding of how education should be designed and implemented. And also the inclusive education rhetoric that is adapted by policymakers or in policies. But sometimes it describes segregating approaches. So it's not always clear that when we talk about inclusive education or when this is mentioned in policies, that everybody understands what inclusive education is about. Sometimes it's another name for segregation and integration. Having a focus on financial resources for inclusive education, it seems that even though funding and resourcing inclusive education is critically important for all countries, it's massively neglected in the literature of inclusive education. There are not many sources there, although there are some very interesting studies. It's not a very well-researched topic, we would say. We also have to face the challenge that the move towards inclusive education is done by many countries that turn towards inclusive education, as we heard earlier, but the allocation of financial resources remains unchanged. So even though policies change, commitments change, the financial resources are more reluctant to change. So we have a paradox. Inclusive education policies, or at least termed that they are inclusive, but also the increasing need to label the learners in order to secure funding. This is not very helpful if we want to commit to inclusive education. Looking into the literature, we can realize that there is a variation of funding models within and across many countries, and there is a variation in approaches across provinces and territories of the same country. So funding systems are not always, clear or the same everywhere, even in the same country. According to Banks and his colleagues, there are some predominant resource allocation models, and I will elaborate on those. It's the input funding model, the throughput funding model, and the output funding model. So inputs may also be defined in terms of referral rates, low achievement scores, the number of disadvantaged pupils, and so on. But the key point in that funding is based on the expressed or measured needs. So we understand that this model is closer to an integration approach rather than an inclusive one. When it comes to throughput funding model, funding is based on the functions or tasks that have to be undertaken or developed. So finances are allocated on the condition that particular services will be developed or maintained by a school, municipality, or region. Of course, certain output conditions can be included in this model, but funding itself is not based on outputs or inputs. In this model, governance and accountability can play an important role. So this model might be closer to inclusive education on the one hand, but it still has its drawbacks that we'll discuss in a minute. And it's also the output funding model, which is which means that part of the funding depends on the learning results obtained by students. And we talked about standardized tests already. Learners' progress is measured through these tests, and funding follows schools according to the findings and to the results that children have in standardized tests. There are some important studies from the European Agency on financing inclusive education. Of course, now they can be a bit outdated, but these are the only studies we have. The one in 1991 particularly investigated resourcing special needs education, and the one in 2016, inclusive education. So the conclusions from these studies that examined the funding systems in some of the countries who are members of the European Agency were that where we have input funding model, it seems that the labeling of learners is prioritized. So support relates to the need for an official decision. Another limitation of the input funding model is that special schools are not encouraged to take the role of resource centers, which is they are expected to do in inclusive education systems. So funds are allocated to special schools based on the number of learners enrolled. If we go for a throughput funding model, this may lead to inactivity and inertia since funds are generally available. So there is no need for labeling, which is a good thing. But then there are funds there, and it's very easy not to control or understand how these are allocated for inclusive education. So the European Agency concludes that governance and accountability mechanisms are necessary. And then the achievement of a balance between input and throughput approaches is necessary. So it's not just one model, but it's how models are combined to serve the interests of learners in inclusive education systems. There's another study that comes from Banks and his colleagues, which is a comparative one and compares the systems of Ireland, Norway, and Italy. And as you can see in this table, which is from the paper, the authors conclude that funding structures are strictly intertwined with conceptualizations of inclusive education policy. So in the upper part of this table, you can see a very brief description of the country's policies. Of course, in the paper, they are more detailed. But as we see Ireland here, inclusive education represents one way, together with special schools and classes, to respond to special educational needs. It is discussed in terms of effectiveness of students' learning outcomes. The funding model in this system is mixed, so it combines output, throughput, and input model. In Norway, inclusive education is understood in terms of a strategy for contributing to equality in society. It comprehends the idea that adapted education responds to those that do not benefit from ordinary education. It has been long conceived in opposition to special education, while recently special education tends to be perceived as part of inclusive education. According to the authors, in Norway, there is no specific funding for inclusion or special education, only funding for general education. And schools are autonomous for funding on school level, and the same applies for Ireland. In Italy, a contradiction exists between a general education system sensitive to equity and differences on one side, and inclusive education understood as the right of some students to get personal obstacles for food development and participation compensated on the other. So input model based on a category-based medical understanding of special educational needs is applied. National funding rules are common to all schools. And I quote the authors here who say that inclusive funding structures and models cannot be explored, developed, or reformed in an isolated manner because their understanding is strictly interconnected with a more general understanding of inclusion and equity in education. So we need to see all this, the commitment to inclusion, how inclusive education is understood, is interlinked with how the countries develop their policies. Another study which is relevant to how resource allocation is approached in the different countries is the one that explores the narratives of funding related to inclusive education in Canadian news media. This is an interesting study because it explored many publications in the media, and it seems that the authors come to the conclusion that media articles support the need for increased funding for inclusive education using needs-based arguments. And as you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side of the paper, the circles around the central circle there describe the topics that the mass media news were concerned with. And it seems that the trade unions, the governments, and political parties highlight different aspects that have to do with the provisions, the specialist provision and funding specialist provision, to highlight needs-based arguments. For example, a political party they used based on labels arguments to require for more funding for children with autism in the autistic spectrum disorder. Also, trade unions usually require for more specialist teachers or more educational assistants with the argument that teachers can't do it all. So it seems that there is a spiral narrative that situates complex classrooms and needy students at the core, and the range of funded supports are believed to be necessary to varying degrees for these students to be effectively included. But will inclusive education be implemented if more funds are allocated? Is this what is really needed to have inclusive education? So Thompson et al. And the colleagues use these two approaches to explain the difference. There's the relocation approach to inclusive education, which represents the idea that more services and supports are needed, more educational assistance, more specialists, and so on. But on the other hand, there is transformative approach to inclusive education, which is the idea that learners' inclusion is linked with teachers' approaches of differentiated teaching and assessment. and we'll refer to differentiated teaching in a bit. So governments, teacher unions, parents, political parties may have their own interests served by ascribing to the relocation approach of inclusive education, whereas we should consider a transformative approach more. Let's turn now to the human resources for inclusive education. And let me begin by saying that all school staff needs to be prepared for inclusive education. Of course, it's teachers, school leaders, assistants, and any other staff that is based at school, and also staff that is involved in education in other ways. For example, staff that prepares materials for education, or staff that hires people that will work in school. So they should all be prepared for inclusive education. They should all understand the same thing. From the literature, we know that teachers tend to feel unprepared for inclusive education, and this is the case in many countries. And I quote Florian here, who says that deeper consideration needs to be given to the power of the belief that teachers hold about human ability, teaching, learning, and specialist knowledge. Teachers in many countries, mainstream teachers, I mean, have learned that specialists know better. They are not, they don't believe in their own studies. They don't think that all children can learn, and they don't think that they can teach all children, whereas they could if they were empowered to. Also, mainstream and special teachers feel that they have distinct roles. So there is a criticism of the ideological orientation of separate initial teacher education programs that create either general or special teachers. And many countries still have these separate tracks in initial teacher education at a time where we're trying to bring specialist teachers and mainstream teachers closer. So this is not helpful if we want to engage in the process for inclusive education. Another important aspect is teacher professional learning. And by teacher professional learning, we mean all the whole career path of teachers, beginning from student teachers in initial teacher education, beginning teachers, those who just enter schools, experienced teachers, and teacher educators. And by teacher educators, we mean school leaders who can be teacher educators in their schools, and also teacher educators in higher education institutions. It seems that one important gap is in this path is recorded in many countries. So in many cases, initial teacher education functions independently, is not linked to the policy for continuing professional development. In some countries, the induction phase is missing. So not everybody in their career paths are committed in inclusive education, in the principle of inclusive education. In addition, from a review of the literature, we know that special education approaches are still present in various teacher professional learning opportunities. So how can we expect teachers to commit to inclusive education if we don't ensure that all teacher professional learning opportunities are shaped around the principle of inclusive education? So it's necessary to consider how to bridge the gaps in the teacher professional learning career paths, to provide interconnected teacher professional learning opportunities for school staff, to provide school-based professional learning approaches, which encourages links between schools and university. And I call Melensko here, and he also referred to this in his presentation earlier. It's very important for teacher professional learning to be school-based and to for the teachers to know that they have support in engaging in this new way of working. And also avoid superficial approaches in teacher professional learning. And I'm referring here to one-off seminars. Let's talk about inclusion today, or let's talk about differentiation. And then we are not able to know what the teachers learned from this seminar, how they are going to implement differentiation without any support. So it's just TPL activities that have no impact, and this is not helpful if we want to invest in our human resources for inclusive education. Another way to maximize our human resources for inclusive education is to invest on co-teaching. And I'm not talking here about any kind of co-teaching, because in many countries, advertise is not a very good word, but they demonstrate in their documents, or they describe co-teaching approaches in their effort to promote inclusive education. However, the different models that we see in some countries not always promote inclusive education. So again, as inclusive education needs to be understood, we need to understand what we mean by co-teaching for inclusive education. Co-teachers' profiles may vary, but this should be seen as a strength, and teacher professional learning on co-teaching should take these different profiles into consideration. The mainstream and special teachers' traditional roles and duties should be seen in a different way now if we want to move towards inclusive education, but this is not easy for the professionals who are engaged. So TPL for co-teaching is needed, and we need to promote collaboration of teachers throughout the process, before, during, and after teaching, not just in-class collaboration or in-class presence of two teachers, but before, in the planning phase, during teaching, and after teaching for feedback, for review, and then for the preparation for the next course, for the next teaching. Of course, there are barriers for this to be achieved, and there should be ways to move towards to increase co-teaching for inclusive education gradually, because there is more time needed and perhaps more resources. But this should be a more targeted approach to invest on human resources for inclusive education. There are also some studies in the literature that approach co-teaching as a resource for inclusive education. For example, one study here by Simone and colleagues found that job-embedded professional development in Florida increased mainstream and special teachers' engagement in teaching. But in this case, teachers were provided training on school level. It was ongoing, so it could have this impact. And also another study in Germany, where special and mainstream teachers highlight the need for external resources, such as time and equipment, but at the same time, they suggest that there is a need to develop a shared responsibility for inclusive schooling. So it's resources on one hand, but the shared responsibility is at equal terms, and this came from mainstream and special teachers. And moving towards the end, differentiation and universal design for learning should be also something to invest about and invest on. And we see many times in policies that these strategies are mentioned, maybe in the curricula or in policies. But on the other hand, if curricula and policies are not developed in ways that encourage them, they remain just words and wishful thinking for teachers to implement on their own. And of course, it was already mentioned that teachers are on the spot every day trying to manage so many things. So they need to be supported through policies and curricula to develop differentiated teaching and to adapt UDL approaches. So when it comes to differentiation, of course, by Carol Ann Tomlinson, the definition is that the content, process, outcome, and environment needs to be differentiated, considering children's different readiness levels, interests, and learning profiles. But teachers' misconceptions and fear about differentiation are documented in the literature. So if countries just ask the teachers to differentiate, it's most probable that they won't, because they don't really understand what differentiation is about unless they have appropriate TPL opportunities on this. And there are also systemic barriers to differentiation. So if policies or curricula require teachers to differentiate, but at the same time they favor a standardized assessment, then the whole chain and the whole process breaks somewhere, and we can't see the effect of differentiation because some students will fail in the standardized tests. So the curriculum is a starting point here, and we're going back to the slides I showed at the beginning, that there are so many interconnected aspects in moving towards more inclusive education system. We need to have a curriculum that really promotes inclusive education, not just in rhetoric, but in the ways it's structured. We also need to have common understanding of differentiation. For example, the ministries of education and also pedagogical agencies that collaborate with ministries and the universities should have the same understanding of what differentiation is. And there are examples of countries that universities have a particular view of differentiation and teach differentiation in a particular way, according to the literature, and the ministry perceives differentiation as differentiating for one student, the student with disabilities. Again, like co-teaching, teacher professional learning for differentiation should be school-based, ongoing, and also linked to co-teaching. So again, we see another link here, how human resources can be, we can make more use of human resources. And universal design for learning, which was defined by CAST, engagement, representation, action, and expression are the three key pillars of UDL. But how can we facilitate teachers in understanding the concept, and also how policies can help them, can make it easier for them to engage in this idea? We want accessibility at different levels, at school building and classes. We can't expect teachers to organize learning and also try to overcome different barriers to make their classes more accessible. For example, chairs and desks can be a barrier for some children. So if we don't have this in place, then how can we ask teachers to move on and differentiate? Also, textbook developments. We know that countries may, at least in centralized systems, textbook development is undertaken by teams that may be based in the Ministry of Education or in pedagogical agencies. But are textbooks developed in ways that can reach all learners? Are they accessible, for example? Do we have educational material banks that provide texts in different modes, in easy to read, in plain text, in audio, in visual form? If we don't invest on this, then we will demand teachers to develop these materials. And this is asking too much, and of course, another barrier to inclusive education. So again, we need to, countries are required to have teacher professional learning for UDL, emphasize the use of technology and perhaps the use of AI tools, and support teachers in their efforts to teach inclusive settings. And coming now to a conclusion, how we make things happen. Commitment to inclusive education requires minimizing exclusion. We can't just say we want to turn towards inclusive education, but at the same time invest on traditional practices of exclusion. Countries need to contextualize their approaches in resource allocation for inclusive education. This webinar is very useful today because we can see, and I think the participants will have a good idea of what happens in different countries, what are the different approaches, what are the challenges there. But each country needs to contextualize human and resource allocation and make the decision based on the system they have and the vision they have to change it to the better. Decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that can promote inclusive education. This is what I started with, and this is what I want to end the presentation with. And I finish with a quote from Hegarty on this point, who says, educational policy is a construct of many factors and those who would influence policy must be aware of these factors and understand the interactions between them. Expert teaching, likewise, is a product of many inputs, and both teacher education and school improvement must be cognizant of that. Thank you, and I'd love to answer your questions.